Hello, this is episode 3 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, a former contributing editor to Black Belt Magazine. I tell stories about martial arts, and now I'm doing it with this podcast. We're going to be joined in a little while by our guest, Kelly McCann, who, besides having served in an elite Tier 1 military unit, was one of the main creators of the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, which is taught for hand-to-hand combat to all United States Marines. And we'll go into that in a few minutes. But first, a couple of things I wanted to bring up. On last week's show, I had mentioned how Alexander Volkanovski seemed unable to defend against calf kicks in his UFC 298 loss to Ilya Topuria. That prompted a question from a listener asking, just how do you go about defending against calf kicks? Which is an interesting question since you really see very few fighters who do have any defense at all against this technique. Most of them, if they can't just move out of the way, simply eat the kick on their calf, which is not a winning formula. But you see it over and over again in MMA where a fighter's mobility becomes compromised after just a few hard calf kicks. Besides Volkanovski, it seemed to happen to Paulo Costa after he ate a few calf kicks in his fight with Robert Whittaker, also at UFC 298. Calf kicks can be just a brutal technique, which I know from personal experience. I remember back when I was a teenager still doing karate, we were practicing foot sweeps in the dojo, and I was paired with this older gentleman who was a beginner, but just one of those guys who had a very hard, dense bone structure. Anytime you banged against him, you came away all bruised up. And I was letting him try to practice his foot sweep on me, but he was so awkward, he just hauled off and hit me with a roundhouse kick on the calf. I literally saw stars and thought I was going to pass out because the pain was so intense. I ended up on crutches for a month with a completely torn calf muscle. So, yeah, calf kicks work. Then maybe 12, 13, 14 years ago, I was finally actually taught how to use calf kicks as a proper fighting technique. This was well before anyone was using them in the UFC. You never really saw them in any kind of fighting back then because they just weren't common even in Muay Thai. But I was training with a guy named Phil Dunlap who used to fight over in Southeast Asia doing Burmese boxing or Lethwei as it's called, which is a bare knuckle fighting style that looks a little like Muay Thai but allows headbutts and all sorts of other fun, savage things that aren't allowed in Thai boxing. And there are some regional differences in Burmese boxing. Some areas they kick more like Muay Thai, but in the part of the country Phil lived in and fought in, they did a lot of calf kicking. So he taught it to me, and like I said, it's brutally painful to absorb one of those, even when both people are wearing some protective padding and training. So the first thing I said to him after he taught it to me was, okay, how do you defend against this? Because I didn't want to start eating those things on my calf. And he taught me his method of defending, which he called snow plowing, where you turn your leg outward so your shin is facing in the direction of the oncoming calf kick, and then raise your heel off the floor, almost like a karate cat stance, but you lean all your weight forward onto the toes or ball of that foot and lean your knee out so it's a little in front of the foot. That puts your shin on an angle rather than straight up and down, and that will protect it from taking too much of a direct impact from your opponent's shin. It'll still hurt, but nowhere near as much as absorbing a kick flush on your calf. And it will also hurt the opponent's shin a bit. That's one way of defending the calf kick. Another is to just raise your leg up so the calf kick passes under that leg. The problem with this defense is if the opponent has stepped in very deep when he throws his kick, his leg may take out your back leg and drop you to the ground. But both of these defenses can work, and there are others that you can do as well. But this kind of goes to the not always high level of coaching we see in mixed martial arts. And I'm not necessarily saying Volkanovski or some of these other fighters weren't coached in how to defend against calf kicks. Sometimes fighters are just reluctant to use a defense or just not good enough to use it. But you do tend to see in MMA a less than expert level of coaching at times. And that's understandable because there are a lot of ingredients to that game. Punching, kicking, wrestling, clinching, groundwork, submissions. And it's hard for anyone to be an expert in all of those things. A lot of your better gyms will bring in experts in each of these individual areas to coach the fighters as a team, but not everyone does that. And a lot of martial artists out there still love to think they know everything. And moreover, they want to make their students and their fighters think they know everything, even when they don't. An example of what I would call less than great MMA coaching was from this past week's UFC Mexico card, where one fighter, Francisco Prado, had his eye basically punched shut by his opponent, and he came back to his corner after the second round, I think it was, and his coach reportedly said, "You don't need your eyes, just fight." Now, the coach claims what he actually said was, "You don't need your eyes if you fight in the clinch," which I'm not sure is that much better. In an interview, the coach later said this was their Rocky and Mickey moment, referring to the movie Rocky. What I think he overlooked was in that movie, the trainer Mickey wanted to stop the fight because Rocky couldn't see out of one eye, but it was Rocky who insisted on continuing to fight. The trainer here also was quoted in this interview as saying, "Both of us were willing to die for a victory." Well, only one of you was actually in danger of dying. That was the fighter who ended up fortunately just losing a decision. You, the trainer, on the other hand, were safe in the corner with two good eyes, not taking any punches, and in no danger of dying. So I'd say there's a little bit of a difference there. Anyway, another item which I've seen in some of my news feeds lately pertains to the Indian Army formalizing different types of martial arts training for its troops. A lot of this stems back to an incident that occurred about 4 years ago, which I reported on a little bit for a couple of outlets when it happened, but seemed to mostly go unnoticed by a lot of the martial arts world. It's an incident which anyone interested in the application of any traditional form of martial arts weaponry might want to examine, though. So there's a disputed border region between India and China called the Galwan Valley. And by mutual agreement, troops from both sides are forbidden from using firearms there. And what happened back in 2020 was a number of Chinese army troops, supposedly wearing a bit of body armor, attacked a group of Indian troops with makeshift weapons, basically going old school, using iron rods, spiked clubs, things of that nature. And the Indian troops fought back with whatever makeshift weapons they had. From most descriptions, this was basically a throwback to medieval style combat on the battlefield. Accounts vary, but it seems at least 2 dozen men in total were killed from this clash. While, like any military battle, it's really regrettable something like this ever had to happen. And you'd think if both sides could agree not to use guns, they could just agree to not fight at all. But from the point of view of people who analyze what works and doesn't work in not just modern martial arts, but in more ancient forms of combat, this was a fascinating thing to try and examine and learn from. But from what I saw recently of the hand-to-hand combat training the Indian Army is now offering in response to this, I would say not everybody is learning the correct lessons. though they say they're incorporating mixed martial arts as part of their training. From the various videos I've seen, it seems to be more a hodgepodge of practical and not so practical methods that includes a little bit of MMA, a little bit of traditional karate, maybe a little Krav Maga type stuff, and most interestingly, some traditional Indian martial arts. And India has a long and impressive history of martial arts that we don't hear a lot about. At one time, back in the early 20th century, the best wrestlers on earth all came from India. And for hundreds of years, they also practiced an art called Vajramushti, which was kind of like MMA done with brass knuckles on one hand and included a lot of the same joint locks you see in modern styles like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But those were not the arts the Indian Army seems to be borrowing from here. Instead, it looked to me like they were drawing from some of the more traditional Indian arts like Kalari Payattu, which has kind of a kung fu-like look to it and incorporates a lot of traditional Indian weapons. And you would think some sort of training with old-fashioned weapons would be logical, at least for troops stationed in the Galwan Valley. But when you look at a lot of the traditional martial arts that make use of weapons, what they do may have been very practical and effective centuries ago, but in modern times it seems to have turned into something more oriented toward performance or fitness rather than real combat. If you watch the way these traditional Indian styles are demonstrated now, even in this clip I saw of the Indian Army, they were practicing something that looked more like what you'd see in a kata tournament than on a battlefield. And you might wonder why a modern military would be teaching something like this as part of their hand-to-hand combat training. But it's not totally unheard of, because the way a lot of militaries, not to mention law enforcement agencies around the world, decide on what to teach their troops for hand-to-hand combat often isn't based on what's the most useful or practical method. What they often end up teaching is some sort of local art because there's a feeling of national pride and we don't need a foreign martial art. We have our own fighting art, which is better than any foreign art. And a lot of the people who make the decisions on this stuff, the generals in charge of the army, they often don't know anything at all about martial arts or hand-to-hand combat, so they'll just take advice from people who have a personal stake in what gets taught, or they just base their decisions on public relations so they can show everyone how strong their country is by touting their own local martial arts. Israel does this with Krav Maga, Russia does it with Sambo, the Japanese police forces do this with Judo and Kendo. Not saying that some of these arts aren't effective, because they are, but if you're charged with the defense of your country or the local protection of its civilians, you might do better to put aside nationalistic chauvinism and just try to go for whatever the most effective methods of fighting are when you train your troops. And that's what our guest coming up now did when he helped create the Marine Corps martial arts program years back. Kelly McCann is one of the world's leading experts on security. He served as CNN's on-air security analyst. Prior to that, he was a major in the United States Marine Corps, where he was one of the main people responsible for designing the Marine Corps martial arts program. He also served in an elite Tier 1 special missions unit tasked with counterterrorism operations around the world. He was a colleague at Black Belt Magazine for a number of years, and it's an honor to welcome him to the show. Kelly, are you there?
Hi, Mark. I am.
Thank you for coming on today. It's much appreciated.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
So, just to give people some background on you, you started in martial arts as a kid, mostly with boxing. Is that right?
That's true, Mark. Back in the day, I'm pretty old. I'm 65 now. So back in the day when I was growing up, boxing was way more readily available, right? You had like Knights of Columbus boxing, you had the Police League, the Fire League, the YMCA. So it was very, very accessible. So at an early age, my dad thought it would be a good thing to get me involved in boxing. That's how I got started.
Right. And you got into Muay Thai as well. Was that as a kid or after you had joined the military?
No, that was much later in like 1990. I started doing Muay Thai, and that was at the time I was working for an entity that trained a lot of lettered agencies. This is before I started Crucible, and one of the clients was Dev Group or SEAL Team Six, and they were all doing Muay Thai, and it really interested me. So I started studying that, and then what I did, Mark, was I kind of got a westernized approach to it.
Hmm.
I'm not big into the traditional, 3-step march going straight forward. So I inculcate Western boxing movement into the style of Muay Thai that I teach.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of the better Thai fighters nowadays do that, but that wasn't as common back then. I think there was more of a traditional slant to the hand techniques that were used in Muay Thai back then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was just like stand and bang, and it
Yeah,
just didn't make sense. It just from a damage standpoint, it didn't make sense to me.
right. And you joined the Marine Corps out of college, was that right?
I did the very first. I was going to enlist in the Marine Corps, and I was boxing, I was racing motorcycles, and doing all those kinds of pursuits that young men do. And my
Mhm.
my dad was the one that said, "Look, you got to do something. I mean, after high school, you can't just keep boxing, and you need money to
Yeah.
live. So I went to St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. It's a Catholic college. And when I went there, the very first month that I was on campus, the Marines were on campus recruiting. And so I made sense to me that if I wasn't going to enlist, then I was going to actually get a degree to join the Marine Corps and become an officer. So that's what I did. So I joined in 1976, and then I got commissioned in 1980.
You had several family members that had been served, right? Had that always been in the back of your mind?
Yeah, that's correct. Like my grandfather was a Marine in World War One. My other grandfather was a soldier, a combat engineer in World War One. My uncle was served in World War Two and hit Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, and was pretty highly decorated. So my whole family, many members, not all of them, but many members went into the service. It just always seemed a good move for me.
Right. And once you joined up, you were continuing to train in different martial arts. You mentioned Muay Thai. Were there other arts that you explored while you were in the Marines?
Sure, like anybody, I mean, I did the journey, and dabbled in just about anything that I could find. I was a voracious reader, so I read everything I could get my hands on about combatives and traditional martial arts and different styles and things like that, the World War II stuff, all of
Right.
that stuff. So I continued to train, all of that. I don't think I've ever stopped, quite frankly, since the time I was 12.
Right. Yeah, I know you're a little like me, kind of an iconoclast that doesn't believe in individual styles too much. But of all the things that you did train in, was there any that you found most useful over the years?
Yeah, I mean, you can never go wrong. And you and I have talked about this before. I mean, like you can never go wrong with like boxing and wrestling, right?
Yeah.
Or Muay Thai and BJJ.
Right.
That's just great combination. It's just really gives you a holistic game. But along the way, there were some other things that really piqued my interest. I did FMA for quite a while, Filipino martial
Hmm.
arts, because I just really liked the way that they had that philosophy that the stick is the knife is the stick, the angles are the same, the movements are the same. Some of their unarmed techniques, the guntings and stuff like that, has good application, not as fight enders, but as fight benders, and
Right. Right.
that informs the rest of what you're doing, right? So you like you take a little bit from here, you take a
Yeah.
little bit from there, and you ultimately end up with your own style of combatives, something that
Yeah.
suits you and your physical attributes and all that. So that's kind of the journey that I undertook.
Right. Now, we're talking about combatives. The Marines back then, when you joined, their hand-to-hand training was really more of the old World War II combative stuff, right?
Honestly, when I first went in 1980, there wasn't any unarmed combat. I mean, there wasn't any. The first guy that brought it back, and he brought it back with the line program,
Right.
was Ron Don Vito.
Mhm.
And Ron, uh, line, I had issues with line and the way it was, um, the content, but I highly admire Ron because he was able to basically take a huge institution like the Marine Corps and get them training in a
Right.
formalized program, and that's no small undertaking.
And we should mention that by combatives, when people think of that, we're thinking of kind of the old World War II style movements, which were very rough, simple self-defense type moves like knees to the groin or palm heel strikes to the chin that you'd see in a lot of regular self-defense classes nowadays. And I know you have a certain respect for a lot of those old combative techniques and still teach them, but I think you also, like me, take a more modern approach that you believe whatever a person learns needs to be pressure tested and grounded in realistic fighting practices, basically combat sports stuff, like you were saying, boxing and wrestling or Muay Thai and BJJ, that kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a member of the Combatives Association, under Matt Larson and John Valentine and all those guys. If any of the listeners haven't looked at that, go on Facebook and look up the
Mhm.
Combatives Association. Um, Good skill level of all the combative association instructor group of which I'm part. But very those guys are very, very skilled jiu-jitsuans. A lot of them have second, third degree black belts in BJJ. But I think that the most informed thing is like you can't look at old school World War II stuff in a post UFC world or post MMA world and cling on to that.
Yeah.
So for me, the World War II stuff, you can look at it on it. By the time that I was exposed to it, you can look at it and go like, a lot of this is just pure bullshit. I mean, this is just really bad, static kind of thing. But if you put it in perspective, the reason that the military started doing combatives was because a lot of the guys that went into serve had never been in a fight. So it was a way to get guys to mix it up, to get rough and tumble, to knock each other around. And actually, it was studied, and what they found was people who had, been hit in the face and gone through combatives or boxed or whatever tended to do better in combat.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so if you look at it purposefully, that was really the purpose. The other thing is, of course, back then there was no general knowledge of Muay Thai and jujitsu and
Right.
stuff like that. It was very, very difficult to access those kinds of things back in the day.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what's interesting, and we've talked about this before between us, that a lot of the people who love talking about pure combatives or pure self-defense type training forget that the guys who came up with all that stuff, like William Fairburn, who developed a lot of the World War II combatives, and Emi Lichtenfeld, who's the main guy usually credited with inventing Krav Maga, those guys came out of combat sports background. They boxed or wrestled or did judo, and that often gets lost on people, doesn't it?
oh yeah, I mean, like, and you can go down, like you can look at Dermot O'Neill, you can look at Deliscu from the Army.
Mhm.
They were very focused on combat sports, and it really chaps my ass when people today impugn combat sports because you know when we own and run Renegade Combat Sports, and we
Mhm.
fight at a pretty high level, a national level,
Right.
and
You got
uh,
some pro fighters there, right?
got pro
Yeah.
fighters and amateur fighters, and people always will say like, well, there's a referee, there's timed rounds, there's, and that's all true. However, it doesn't remove the fact that when you get into the cage or you get into the ring, if you're doing boxing, Muay Thai, you are absolutely trying to hit that person as hard as you possibly can. You're trying to kick them as hard as you can. You're trying to outmaneuver them, outposition them, and ultimately knock them out, choke them out, or submit them. There's not a safe button. There's not a sport mode. It's
Yeah.
not like,
Yeah.
and that's for all the people who impugn combat sports and its applicability to combatives. Most of them have never done it,
Right.
right? They've never, go ahead.
No, I think ultimately the way that you do it and a few of the people that we know, like Matt Larson, Greg Thompson, Craig Douglas do it, it
Yep.
is probably the way to go. It's a merger of those kind of things that you're talking about. They have a combat sports background where they understand the practicality of actually getting in and fighting full contact or wrestling all out, and they understand the value of some of the dirty techniques, let's say, groin shots or eye gouges or things like that. But, try to do those things without having a background in people punching you in the face or trying to throw you and choke you doesn't work that well. But when you
No,
can merge those, that's when it seems to come together as something really practical.
that's absolutely right. You might remember, he stopped saying it, but several years ago, Dana White, one of the taglines on the UFC was "as real as it gets,"
Yeah.
and and that is the truth, right? I mean, if you are, you can use, I mean, if you look at the unified MMA rules, there's very few things really that are, against the rules.
Yeah.
It's a little bit better than it was back in the NHB days. We used to run a local fight thing here called the FFC, which is the Fearless Fighting Championship. And back then, the rules were you couldn't fish hook, you couldn't eye gouge, and you couldn't do single digit manipulation. But virtually everything else, hair pulling, groin shots, all of that was legal. You know,
Yeah, I
um,
think whatever rules are in place now as far as no groin shots or no gouging, I don't know of any traditional martial arts styles that are based, the majority of their techniques are based in those things. The majority of what's done in most traditional martial arts styles is perfectly legal in MMA. And I've always had
yes,
the opinion that if you can't make your techniques work in an MMA fight against somebody of comparable experience and size, then you just can't make them work.
that's right, and that begs the validity of the technique. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's the thing, the efficacy of what you're trying to teach. Nobody does anything because they think it's stupid, right? So people
Mhm.
who are doing combat tai chi, they think it's the ass. They think it's
Yeah.
the greatest thing in the world. Um, the difficulty is how do you actually arrive at the validity of a technique? And people use the words pressure testing.
Hmm.
I mean, pressure testing is get in a fucking ring or get in a cage. That's
Yeah.
pressure testing,
Yeah.
you know, with someone who is intent on knocking you out or hurting you. Then you'll know pretty quick whether you can pull it off or not.
Yeah. And we should say, self-defense or combat sports aren't the only reason people train. Some people may train for discipline or fitness or just to have fun. And those are all viable reasons for training. But somebody like you that has been in a profession that requires violence on occasion, you're interested in what will actually work in a serious life and death fight. And that's what we're talking about here, not necessarily whether martial arts are good for discipline or fitness or as an
That's
aesthetic art form.
kind of the difference between jutsu and do. I mean,
Yes.
just you just being totally skill based and no philosophy behind it, but does it work or doesn't it? And
Yeah.
do being way of life and all of
Yeah.
that.
So yeah, you have a pretty broad knowledge of all these different fighting arts, and we're one of the main people that was tasked with helping to redesign the Marines hand-to-hand combat program in the mid 1990s, right?
That's right. George Bristol, Colonel George Bristol, was at Quantico, and him and Cardo Urso, who later Cardo went on to be a UFC judge.
Right.
He judged, I don't know, 500 bouts. Great guy, and then also was the lead combatives guy for the U.S. Air Marshals.
Hmm.
They contacted me and said, "Hey, we're gonna redo the complete program." At the time, the commandant wanted to bring back like a belt system,
Right.
to give people a chance to, up their cutting scores so they could promote early and things like that.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an innovative approach, and so they got a hold of me and myself, Bob Casper, a whole collection of guys. Probably there was 12 of us. Jim Smith, former Marine Raider, came. And we for about a week went through the line program, and Ron was there. Ron Don Vito was there, And he was fully invested in his program, of course.
Sure.
And it was a process to kind of come around to, like, okay, what is this thing called MCMAP, and what is it going to be, and what are we trying to do? And then subsequent after that happened, and they started to promulgate all the knowledge out and build instructors and all that stuff. It's morphed time and again based on who's running the school at the time,
Hmm.
like is common in most military units. It's a reflection of the commander, right? So it's gone through various iterations, just like the Army's modern combatives program.
Yeah.
So it was a cool thing to be involved with.
Yeah, I know. I think you had told me you originally weren't in favor of the belt system and some of the more traditional aspects of it, but you came around eventually, saw that there was some utility to that.
Sure, there was utility. I mean, let's be honest, okay? Like, even at the tiered unit level, if you have two training things and one is shooting and one is combatives, which is going to be more well populated?
Hmm.
Shooting.
Yeah.
Even at that level, even with direct action guys, of which I was one, where your job is to use kinetics and go out there and do that, people prefer not to do it. Now, there's people like you and I and a bunch of guys that we know who are just really into it, and we just like it, and it's always been part of our life, and we'll always do it. But that's a small percentage. Even in those meat eating communities,
Yeah.
it still remains a small percentage
Well, I
of the guys.
think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I think what a lot of people don't understand about training guys within the military or even in law enforcement is it's kind of the opposite of running a martial arts school or martial arts gym that, in a martial arts school, everybody wants to be there. They're interested in martial arts, but in the military, you're getting a lot of people who have no interest in martial arts, and you have to somehow convince them to buy into doing this training.
That's exactly right. And interestingly, in the Combatives Association, there's a bunch of guys that are very, very experienced, both in the military and also in the law enforcement. And some of those guys, Sam Ferguson, John Valentine, a lot of these guys have opened up instruction for people free for police
Hmm.
and crickets. Nobody,
Yeah,
nobody comes.
yeah.
And they're all like legitimate, no kidding, serious BJJ black belts. They're former cops. They know what works, what doesn't work, what's applicable, and they'll still get zero people to show up for training. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
I think it's like any other job that you get a handful of people who are really dedicated and want to be the best at their job. And, people everywhere, most people are just there to punch a clock and get a paycheck. And, they're going to do the minimum they can to get by. I think that's true of all fields, not just law enforcement or military or whatever. So somehow they have to, raise the level of the people in those professions that they want to be the best at that profession.
And that's what Matt Larson is trying to do. Like, he's trying to, with this association, it was him and John Valentine that came up with this idea. They're trying to raise the bar in the culture, and it it defies logic that if you go out every night as a law enforcement officer, and we all know what's going on with police these days and how they're attacked and all of that,
Yeah.
you would want to do everything you could do for your survival, you know, but they don't. They don't come to training. They don't barely attend in service training, and that's only because they're forced to.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's what drives the lawful but awful shootings that we always see. Like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I don't have any hand skills, but I got a gun, it's going to start there. My verbal commands, my gun is out.
Right.
And that's not the way it ought to be, but it happens to be the way it is.
Yeah. Now, I had talked earlier in the show about how some countries go with just their local martial arts when they develop a hand-to-hand combat program for their military. And they do this out of a sense of, I don't know, national pride, where they just want to teach what was done locally to show how great their country is. That was not part of your thinking when you guys put together MCMAP, the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, was it?
No, we went outside, and at that summit that I talked about earlier,
Mhm.
there were all kinds of styles represented. I mean, there were some, Marines that were old time hard style karate guys there. There was a ninjutsu guy there. There was,
That
every kind.
Aikido guy, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And we looked at and borrowed from and kind of melded skills together that made sense. And I had all the guys down to my place for an evening so they could see firsthand what we do. And there were a few people in that group that basically weren't accusatory, but they were like, "Well, you're just like doing hyper violent, like these aren't warrior knights; they're warrior thugs." And it was like, "What the fuck did you just say? Like, are you kidding me?"
Well,
You know what I
I'm
mean?
not sure that in classical terms there was that much of a difference between a knight and a thug. I mean,
Right,
historically, I think both guys are going out trying to wreak mayhem on their enemies. So,
100%. But it was just, I felt like that the people they had at that summit, it was an even representation for like the typical TMA guys to the
yeah.
nope, I'm club fighting in smoky basements,
Yeah.
and everyone and everybody in between.
How did you manage to arrive at a consensus? Was there one person that finally made the decision, or did you vote on it? Well, how?
Well, I mean, the big thing I think when you have a group like that is to make the group understand that the product you're trying to make isn't going to be trademarked as an individual, right? Like
Right.
that it's a collective effort. Everyone's got a voice, but there is consensus, and that's basically what occurred was that we arrived at consensus, and then of
Yeah.
course Bristol and Urso, once the summit was over, took all the notes, took all the stuff into consideration, and then did reach backs to us for, hey, can you clarify what you meant by blah blah blah? And they were the ones that actually authored the current McMac
Right.
McMap program after our input.
Right. And we should point out that even with the changes it had, MCMAP is still going strong today, still being taught as
Yep,
hand-to-hand combat for all Marines, and still producing Marines that are very capable of fighting at close quarters.
absolutely. Yeah, the mindset has never
Right.
wandered. The one mind, any weapon. Kind
Right.
of thought.
If you had to describe the main ingredient or the main thing you were trying to get across to troops, would that be it? That concept of one mind, any weapon?
Yes. Yep. And
And
and and and in descending scale, if you're doing unarmed combat, why isn't something in your hand?
Mhm.
In particular as it applies to battlefield, because on the battlefield there's implements, right? There's
Right.
things that you can use to hit people with and cut people with and
Yeah.
all that stuff. So if you're ultimately finding yourself in a true unarmed confrontation, why? I mean, like what's going
Yeah.
through your head? But
Um,
I think the biggest thing that I see, like in the combatives community, and not so much in the Army, is very ground based, and the Marine Corps has become more ground based, but
mhm.
certainly in the World War II purists that are out there and things like that, you always hear guys say stupid shit like, never go to the ground, don't ever go to the ground, and
Yeah.
and that
Which
is
may not be
such a
your choice.
well, and that's the point, right? Is that's a very presumptuous statement to
Yeah.
make, because if you have no ground game, it's definitely going there because you can't prevent it from
Yeah.
going there.
Yeah. I think Greg Thompson gave me the example once that you could be an Olympic wrestler who thinks he'll never get taken down, but if you're in a room with your back of your legs against a coffee table and somebody comes flying at you, you're going down.
That's exactly right. And if you're just a guy that's used to doing axe hands and face mashes and shit like that, and
Mhm.
and are a true believer like that, and you have impact on a young kid that might have been a high school wrestler,
Right.
and he decides, okay, I don't want to get hit like that anymore. He's going to take you down.
Yeah.
He's going to single leg you or double leg you or whatever, or just an outright football
Right.
tackle.
Right. And by the same token, the guy who may be a world-class BJJ guy, if there's broken glass all over the ground and you're facing two guys, you probably don't want to be on your back rolling around like that,
Hey,
right?
dude, one of the most instructive things we do in our ground fighting classes, both in our instructor development program and also in all the classes we do is we take people outside on the pavement.
Oh
And
man, I hate that.
yeah, bro, because
Yeah.
on a mat in a friction-free environment, you can spin and turn and do all that stuff. Man, your back hits that asphalt and it's like being on sandpaper. You can't move freely.
Yeah, I used to work out with an FMA guy. He would show me FMA and I'd show him some MMA stuff and we'd do it in his driveway. And he had a small mat, but nobody, neither of us could fit fully on the mat. So one of us was always, on his knees and elbows digging into that asphalt and just being
Yep,
on top is miserable like that.
it's horrible.
Yeah.
You know, another thing that we there's a huge difference, and you know this, you've been doing this long time as well. There's a huge difference between like IBJJF rules and MMA jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah, each
Strike,
one has its own, and MMA jiu-jitsu different than street jiu-jitsu.
that's
Uh,
right.
so, each one is kind of a step up on the reality scale. But, if you haven't done at least the MMA version where you're absorbing some strikes down there, you may start to drift into some less than practical stuff.
Which is all over the internet right now.
Yep.
They're basically like the old school meat puppets and combatives. Like they'll show a technique that's very, very complicated, very sophisticated, and their opponent, in quotes, doesn't move.
Yeah.
And they're reaching and grabbing and spinning. And, it begs the question, well, what the fuck's he doing while you're doing all that?
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to touch on here was you served in what's known as a Tier 1 unit, which is what a lot of people call special operations. You refer to it as special missions, but these are units that are typically tasked with very sensitive missions like hostage rescue, counterterrorism. I think when you were in it, you were doing a lot of counter narcotics operations in foreign countries. Is that accurate?
Yeah, a lot of counter narcotics, a lot of counterterrorism.
Yeah. And I know you don't like to talk about the specific unit you were in, so won't mention that, but people should know Tier 1 units are really at the pinnacle of the special operations or special missions community. And while a lot of people in martial arts make all sorts of wild claims about their top secret commando experience, Kelly legitimately was in one of these elite Tier 1 units. And what I think is interesting from the perspective of a lot of the listeners here is that while nowadays we have a lot of people with military combat experience, in the missions you were engaged in, a lot of times you were in similar circumstances to what a civilian might be facing when confronted with violence because you were operating in very low visibility situations in foreign countries where Americans weren't openly operating, right? You weren't always wearing body armor and carrying rifles. You were,
No. That
yeah,
was the DA part of it. Direct action part of it was one of the skill sets and mission areas, but most of it was going out singleton or in pairs
mhm,
and doing things that fly below the radar, and very, very ticklish kinds of things. I think the big distinguishing characteristics between special operations writ large and SMUs or special mission units are they are special mission units. So,
mhm,
although they're used in conventional warfare, it's usually way before conventional forces show up,
right.
or way forward of special operations personnel utilizing what we did or created uh, to
Right.
assist the mission. Yeah.
So you were in hostile situations where all you might have on you was a concealed handgun or some type of less than lethal weapon like pepper spray, right?
Yes.
And that's all probably the most that any civilian would be able to carry on them if they're ever confronted by an attacker. So how does that change the dynamics of someone looking to defend themselves when their weapons are not only somewhat minimal, but they have to be very well concealed?
You become an expert at reading people and situations,
Mhm.
right? So the idea is obviously you don't want to create an international incident. You don't want there to be, it's clandestine, right? So you
Yeah.
you don't want people to notice you or what you're doing or have done. So you become really focused on hyper avoidance, The skill sets, the soft skill sets like surveillance detection, apprehension avoidance and restraint release in case you get rolled up, being able to escape, things like that become really, really important.
Was
Driving skills, being able to, evade or being able to get away from someone who might have targeted you and now they're chasing you, etc.
Was there any one thing that you looked for that helped you, might have tipped you off that, a troublesome situation was on the horizon or somebody might be trouble and you'd better avoid this?
Well, I mean, the situations that I deploy into are chaotic anyway, right?
Hmm.
So like there's already chaos, but you get to be an expert at the rhythm of the street.
Hmm.
Like there are things that you notice. Like I'll give you a really dumb example. Back in Haiti, when we were down there, and Aristide was going to be brought back in by SEAL Team Six. What there was no law enforcement, there was no military. It was just complete chaos, complete broken society.
Hmm.
And what you can start to notice are trends. So, like what the Haitians would do is they'd start stacking tires. And when they stack tires, that's because that evening they're going to burn them and riot. And
Mm.
so you become really, really good at reading things like that. Conversely, if you look at places like Iraq, because there was a network that of the bad guys, there were many different kinds of bad guys, right? There were friggin' Syrians, there were fucking former Fedayeen. I mean, there was like every criminal gangs, there was everything.
Right.
What you would notice there is nothing. In other words, nobody'd be on the streets, no cars would be out there. Like it'd be like ghost town because
Yeah.
they didn't want to get involved in whatever was planned, and the word had
Hmm.
been put out. So you get really adept at reading things like that and ground truth.
One of the other interesting things I know about you that I don't think the average martial arts person familiar with you would realize is besides being a high-level martial artist, you're also considered one of the world's leading experts on combat handgun use. People might know you for that by the pseudonym you used to write under, Jim Grover. That was back when you were still active duty. Were you trying to keep a low profile by using a pseudonym back then because you were still doing special missions?
Yes, that was exactly the reason. It
Yeah,
wasn't for hype or melodrama or any shit like that. It was because I couldn't have that level of visibility.
right. Yeah, I think when I first heard of you, I think you were in Black Belt, maybe featured in there under your real name, and I'd heard the name Jim Grover before, and I never associated the two. And I had seen you on CNN when you were doing security analysis on there, and I said, "Oh, it's Kelly McCann, the martial arts guy. I know him." And I was out at Paladin Press. I'd done a few projects for them, and people I was with were invited out to do a project out at their headquarters, and they said, they have a library of tapes and books here to have a couple, and they gave me your Crucible series, and then they gave me your book, and by Jim Grover, aka Kelly McCann, and I said, "Oh, Kelly McCann is Jim Grover. I never knew this."
Same
Uh,
guy, man.
yeah.
That was my dad's first name, James or Jim, they used to call him, and my mom's maiden name. That's how I came up with it.
Uh, but I always found it fascinating that most of us struggle to get a high level of proficiency in just one area, like martial arts or just shooting, but you managed to do it in both. How time consuming was that?
Incredibly, but I'm a fairly obsessive person, so when I've got a task at hand and I know that there's a purpose behind it, like I just
Right,
burn on it, right? And
right.
so to get into that space of like shooting that well and doing combatives that well, and
Yeah.
then all the other skills, the protective services skills and the surveillance detection and the fucking CQB and all of that shit, I was completely imbued in that.
Right.
And I'd lie if I didn't say that wasn't at the expense of my family,
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, that's just who I am. I'm just super intense on
Yeah.
things like that.
And you pioneered a lot of stuff with handguns that's now standard in the field, didn't you? Like appendix carry, which is carrying down the front of your pants for concealment, that a lot of people do nowadays, and using red dots on handguns, which are these are the optical sights that put a little, you look through a window and it puts a little red dot on whatever you're aiming at, makes aiming much easier, like a video game. And you were one of the first people to put this on a handgun, right?
I was the first guy.
The
Yeah.
first guy.
And amidst a lot of, well, they were doing it like on in revolver plate matches and stuff like
Hmm.
that, but really big, kind of awkward things to put on a
Right.
revolver. Dr. Optic had these very small, typical of what you see now by Trijicon and Holosun and stuff like that. And so the reason I did it initially was for sight commonality, because it made no sense to me to have a red dot on my rifle. And then if I had a transition, I pop my pistol out. Now I'm back to three dots, and the aiming convention is completely different, right?
Right.
You use a red dot completely differently. So I adopted the sight for pistols, and you wouldn't believe the number of people that said that's stupid. It's unnecessary. I mean, look at now,
And
like
everybody does it now.
everybody does it now. Yep. So it's kind of like the evolution of what you're seeing today with a lot of the products that are being come. It is moving forward.
Yeah.
It's just technology never sleeps.
Was there any commonality you found between the shooting and the hand-to-hand martial arts skills? What did one help the other, or are they two just very different skills that have to be mastered separately?
Well, holistically, in my opinion, you've got to do both, right? Like if
Mhm.
all you are is the gun guy, we're right back to the lawful but awful shootings,
Yeah.
right? So you get a lot of people out there that carry a knife, the edged weapons crowd, and they're kind of crazy in their own right. But they lean on that and they depend on that so much that they're very likely to produce that weapon when it's not appropriate. The
Yeah.
law doesn't protect you from getting your ass kicked, right? The law protects you from an unjust assault. So
Yeah.
if you're part of the problem and then you produce a pistol or a knife, or it's you that escalated it against an unarmed person. If you have no skill set, an angry word and a guy that's fairly physically intimidating could make somebody do that, could make them pop their knife out or draw their weapon or something like that. So
Yeah.
for me, I never really put them apart. I always looked at as holistically. You should be good standing. You should be good on the ground. You should be good with a knife. You should be good with a gun. You should be good with a stick. You should be
Yeah.
good with improvised weapons. It's a holistic undertaking.
Good to have options.
Yes.
Yeah, the his holistic approach seems to really be the best if we're talking about practical self-defense training. What kind of trends are you seeing in general in self-defense or combatives or martial arts nowadays?
There's good and bad. I mean, some of the knife guilds and some of the knife centric groups out there are getting a little bit wacky, and are doing things that are inappropriate or unjustified. Certainly, using a knife against unarmed people, begs the question. Can you walk up on somebody with a palmed knife and just suddenly just start stabbing them? Yeah, and is there a defense to that? Not a good one. You
I
know,
I don't know that most people even know what their knife laws are in their local region. A lot of people that get into, Filipino martial arts and carry knives, I'm not sure they bother to familiarize themselves that a lot of them may be carrying illegal knives.
well, that and also there's just something that is generally perceived as felonious when
Hmm.
you start carving people up.
Yeah,
And the wounding seems egregious, and there's issues with a knife.
yeah,
But and I'm not going to call out any of the groups or anything like that. I mean, people who are in the know probably know the groups that I'm talking about.
yeah.
But at the end of the day, just because a big angry man steps in front of you and you self-evaluate and say, I can't handle this guy unarmed, can you pop a knife out, or is it you that just escalated that incident?
Yeah, no,
You
no,
know,
no. You cannot use excessive force like that. Anybody listening, keep your knife sheathed unless it's a life and death thing and you have no other choice. Otherwise, you're probably facing a jail sentence.
100%. You're going to look good in autumnal colors because orange is coming your way.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah. Again, I think it gets back to what you were saying that a lot of this is being able to spot that trouble, read the streets and see what's going on around you and not be in that situation where
Yeah,
you're going to have to draw a knife.
100%. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, um, you have to be responsible in the application of violence,
Right.
and that includes shooting, for all these guys that are into like, point shooting, or the big buzzword now is predictive shooting, like
Hmm.
I predictively know that the round's going in there. No, predict means you think the round is going to go there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, like, if you did put a couple of rounds into an innocent person or several people in your attempt to use the weapon to stop the problem, the very first thing that a competing attorney would ask you is, how did you shoot this person? Well, I did this point shooting thing, or predictive, or I'm all gate up over the way I shoot. So this is, I'm using this language, and all the guy's going to do is say, what are sights on a weapon for? Why do companies bother to put sights on a weapon?
Yeah.
And of course, the answer is because that means I'm going to hit what I'm aiming at.
Yeah.
So, there's some things that people got to be smart about if they are going to use force, so that the fight after the fight in court goes their way.
Yeah, and people don't realize that even if you win in court, you're still facing a lot of legal costs, a lot of hassle, a lot of time and
That's
money
right.
spent to defend yourself out of this. So overall, you're almost always better in avoiding the situation, even if it involves swallowing your pride, rather than getting into something that may be very costly for you down the road.
In particular, if you train, right? Because now
Yeah,
you're no longer a layman or a layperson.
yeah,
You are, in the eyes of the court, a skilled practitioner.
yeah.
And with a skill, you comes a higher level of responsibility and a higher level of justification necessary for you to use your skills.
Yeah. What else do you see going on in martial arts or self-defense that interests you that you've got an eye on? Anything in particular?
Yeah, there's a cool trend, that Aaron Janetti, Kerry Murakami, Sam Ferguson, Craig Douglas, Cliff Byerly, a lot of the guys at Combative Association are doing, which is this knife control concept kind of thing.
Hmm.
And Craig's been doing it for a long time, right?
Yeah.
The entangled gunfight,
Yeah.
and
We should
the
say
guy.
Craig Douglas has a group called ShivWorks, who's a former narcotics officer. People might know him online under the name South Narc, has been doing practical self-defense stuff, merging realistic MMA type stuff with the use of weapons in training for a long time and is very good.
And they've taken like both a wrestling slash BJJ approach to unexpectedly a knife showing up
Right.
in a fight, right? So they use, like, an arm drag to a duck under to a back take, and
Mhm.
then a bundling where you're basically controlling the far side arm with your two hands, then a takedown, and then ultimately a knockout or a damaging kind of finishing uh, scenario where you've
Right.
basically controlled it. And that's really cool, because one of the remaining things out there that's still hard to do to this day is counter a knife, right?
Yeah.
That's why Fairbairn never, you can't find anything ever written by Fairbairn about counter knife or anything like that, because he didn't believe you could do it.
The only examples that I know, with one or two exceptions, of people actually disarming somebody with a knife are guys who are brandishing a knife, threatening somebody with a knife, not actively trying to kill them with a knife, which is a big difference. If somebody's standing there holding a knife, yeah, maybe you can grab them and do some kind of disarm. But if somebody's coming at you, stab, 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 it's like trying to grab somebody's fist when they're trying to punch you rapid fire. That's not working too well.
No, it's like putting both your hands in a blender.
Yeah.
It's just, so they've done some real, that's a trend right now. Now I will say too, to plug for those guys, that they're being poorly copied. So in other words,
Yeah.
they've put out a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of video out there by Aaron, by Craig, by Kerry, by Cliff, and all those guys of what it looks like.
Hmm.
And instead of going to their courses and actually going through a course and taking it and actually learning from the people who do it and came up with it, they're kind of adapting it. And when you're talking about knife defense, that's nothing to fool around with. I mean, like, you
Yeah.
should go and get qualified instruction, put under pressure, test it, and then maybe you could start replicating it. But right now, I'm seeing a lot of people not attribute the guys that came up with it, and they're kind of running down the road. And really, what it looks like is bad wrestling over a weapon, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, we wrestle. Oh, now I'll throw a gun in the mix, or now I'll throw a knife in the mix. That's not it, right? There's a process and a procedure and a lexicon around it.
Mhm.
And all I would tell people is, if that's interesting to you, you should go to one of them to learn it.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to check out some of their stuff online, particularly Craig Douglas. He has some YouTube videos out. That, if you think you can just do your traditional disarm wrist twist against somebody that's actively trying to kill you with a knife, or that you can hold a knife, or that you're going to have your knife out at the beginning of a fight and be able to stab somebody, that doesn't work either, because you're not walking around with a knife in your hand. You're going to have to draw that knife while somebody's trying to pound your face into hamburger. So that
Exactly.
that in itself is an art.
Yep.
So, and you're still actively teaching, right? You go around teaching shooting seminars, and you have your MMA gym down in, what is it, Virginia?
Yeah, in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That's
Right.
Renegade Combat Sports.
So,
That's the Facebook and Instagram hookup. You can go there and look for us, or Kembativz, spelt phonetically KEMBATIVZ. And if you put that in, you can find our Facebook page and our YouTube channel and our Renegade Combat Sports gym. But yeah, we still we've got an upcoming fight in March 8th down in Tampa for the CFFC. Our bantamweight Hunter Starner is going to get down there and get the W. And then we're still training. We go internationally. I just got called from a group down in Chile that wants us down there. We just got back from Azerbaijan not too long ago. We're going to Sweden again this year for the 8th time. And a lot of that is with official user groups,
mhm.
either government groups or military groups. But yeah, so we still are very, very involved. We still train several high net worth individual details. So yeah, staying. I kind of semi-retired, Mark. Like, I'm not working too
You'll
hard.
never fully retire, I don't think. You love fighting too much. Anything with weapons, without, you just enjoy this stuff.
You totally get me.
Hey, it's really been a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show, Kelly. For people who find out want to more about you, I will put some links down in the show notes. Okay, brother, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, brother. Always great to talk to you, Mark.
Okay. And again, thank you to Kelly McCann for coming on the show. People should definitely go check him out online. We have the links down in the show notes. As always, I also want to thank the Black Swan, Eleanor Academia, for providing the music to the show. Go check her out at eleanoracademia.com. Next episode, we hope to have Ellis Amdor on the show. Ellis is one of the few Westerners to ever achieve certificates of full mastery in two separate Japanese koru systems. These are the ancient traditional fighting arts that were done by the samurai warriors in Japan. And Ellis also works in crisis intervention with police and corrections departments, specializing in how to de-escalate violent conflicts. And he's going to tell us about all of that next time. Until then, thank you for listening and keep punching.